Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Tonight, we're going to hear from Lust, a graphic design practice that tries to map out new terrains for graphic design, software, and new audiences. Founded in 1996 in The Hague by Thomas Castro and Jeroen Barnste, and later by Dimitri Neuvenhausen. Lust works in a number of media, including printed materials, interactive installations, and architectural graphics. And in every instance, the design stems from a concept resulting from extensive research. The process-driven methodology entails developing an analytical system which leads eventually to something that designs itself. This lecture is supported in part by public funds from the Netherlands Cultural Studies. Also, they will be giving a workshop this Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday on the 5th floor for those of you that are signed up. So welcome, Lust.
Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer due. I'm half crazy, or for the love of you. It won't be a stylish marriage, I can afford a carriage, but you'll look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle built for two. The words of that song were the last words, or the last words of the HAL 9000 computer in the film 2001: The Space Odyssey. By use of the by now famous jump cut, the director Stanley Kubrick posits that HAL is a direct descendant of the first tool of man, an animal bone. Lust has always had a keen interest in how tools, technology, and language can be an impetus for graphic design. We are interested in exploring new pathways for design at the precarious edge where new media and information systems, architectural and urban systems, and graphic design and typography overlap. Each of these disciplines has a unique and inherent vocabulary. Is there a meta-language that binds them together? For example, when a graphic designer folds paper, is there an equivalent of an information designer folding data or an architect folding space? At Lust, we often talk about the vocabulary of a project. During the research phase of the project, we don't design. We just try to build the vocabulary of that project. Each sketch or idea embodying a new word. The richer the words, the more elegant the sentences we can speak. There can't be a discussion about meta-language without mentioning renowned American linguist Noam Chomsky. He's a proponent of generative linguistics, which is a set of rules to determine and predict syntactic structure. There are two ideas in generative linguistics that I feel directly relate to meta-language and graphic design: phonemes and morphemes, and recursion. So basically, phonemes is the smallest sound that carries meaning. So in this example on the slide, T is one symbol in the Roman alphabet, but has several phonemes. So in stand, tip, and though, T represents a different phoneme. Morphemes, however, is the smallest linguistic entity that contains syntactic meaning. So -S represents plurality. So in dogs, foxes, and children, actually the S morphs to a different form. I interpret this as a metaphorical difference between the symbol itself and the meanings of a set of symbols may mean. Why are we, as designers, still concerned with what these symbols look like, that is, form, when we probably should be concerned with developing a new design morphology to fit the contemporary world we live in? Let me give you an example. In the age of highly efficient personal text messaging, why are we still designing posters? Or should posters take on a new role in the cityscape? The SMS message, for example, is a more efficient medium which can speak directly to the audience, one-to-one, but lacks maybe, say, typographic differentiation. In this scenario, how can you put emphasis on specific parts of a message? For example, you can't make text bold in an SMS. This then becomes an exercise in morphology instead of form. There are two possible ways to approach this. So on the left, you see an example of restructuring the content. Repetition. Come, 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 come to the exhibition. You can also redistribute the content. That's on the right, sending each word of the message in separate SMSs. Come to the exhibition. The second concept related to Chomsky's generative linguistics is recursion. In generative linguistics, recursion is the embedding of a sentence within a sentence. This enables the ability to describe an infinite number of concepts, thoughts, and ideas. The most complex languages, for example, contain recursion. This is the example, and then another example would be a recursive meal, for example, which might consist of 4 courses. One of the courses containing the same 4-course meal, in one of those courses, again, containing the same 4-course meal, et cetera, et cetera. At Lust, we use similar recursive systems and processes in our design. For example, Charles and Ray Eames' Powers of 10, which we're looking at right now, and the Fibonacci sequence.
So code is language, and it's one of the most powerful tools to generate forms nowadays is, of course, code. The ability to create something from scratch, crossing the boundaries of all kinds of media. The book Form and Code, where a lot of you are probably already familiar with, tries to show just that, the potential of creating and writing software to create form. Together with Casey Rees and Chandler McWilliams, who introduced us, we worked together about 2 years to get the book together. One of the main concepts of the book was to make a book that would appeal to a very broad audience. An audience that is not the in-crowd of people who know about software and writing code, but people who, for instance, heard about a topic but have not any knowledge about it. So we wanted this book to be as affordable as possible, and everything in the book is aimed at that goal. So it's the size, it's not a coffee table book, the way of printing, the paper choice, which was not really a choice. And at Amazon, for instance, this book is now available for $16.47, which I think is quite amazing. The circle shape on the cover reveals itself as type when going inside the book. So from a circle to type, going inside the book, which is introduced by page-filling letters created by code. With the introduction pages. And each chapter consists of specially devised alphabets, which one is here. And the text is a comprehensive introduction to thinking with code, starting with the basics and references in daily life and art like Morse code, to, for instance, Solowitz algorithm-based artworks. And the book is not only showing the, let's say, the most hottest projects from today, but it starts with the forefathers, like, for instance, Ivan Sutherland and his Sketchpad program from 1963, which included a lot of functions that were already way more advanced than, for instance, Illustrator has nowadays. Or Charles Surrey, the sine curve man, and some model of downtown Chicago from 1980, I believe. And the John Maeder's Morisawa posters. So this is an example of the introduction pages. And the letter forms, the idea of the letter forms is that they also change shape according to which combination of letters is next to each other, instead of being a fixed letter form. And in this example, the PostScript language is used the PostScript language normally consists of comments like move to, curve to, and line to. And in this example, simply the move to comment is removed, which renders the letters as a continuous line. So repetition is one, of repeat is one of the chapters. And each chapter ends with code examples, which can also be downloaded from the website, so people can really start playing with them and learning from them. So an alternate clock, time slices. And again, code examples. Some Cracklin work, Barbarian group. Simulation. And more code examples.
In the Chomsky linguistic model, the letter S signifies the speaker, his subject. The linguistic trees always begin with S and are by nature dichomatic, always forking into two branches. In 1,000 Plateaus by Deleuze and Guattari, they propose that the S becomes more of a marker of power than a syntactic marker. You will construct grammatically correct sentences. You will divide each statement into a noun phrase and a verb phrase. This, they criticize, is a limited view, stating that while seemingly abstract, it is not, in fact, abstract enough. Chomsky's hierarchic model cannot describe a complex contemporary non-hierarchic world. So it is this drive to find a new design morphology for a complex contemporary non-hierarchic world that leads us to what we refer to as digital anthropology. According to literary theorist Wolfgang Iser, literary anthropology is a set of interpretive practices associated with reader-text relations. He suggests that while the reader always has an interpretation of the text he or she is reading, the interpretation itself participates in the ongoing development of the reader's self-identity. Literary anthropology research is therefore organized by the belief that a relationship to a literary text can become an interesting point for the continued interpretation of culture and the way culture is weighted. It is within these literary denominators that society collect past, present, and projected interpretations of themselves and their situations. This is where the role of digital tools come into play. In his seminal work, SZ, Roland Barthes uses 5 literally analytical devices or codes to construct de Balzac's Sarrasine in order to denote how and where different codes of meaning function. We too can use similar methodologies to lay bare the semantic structure of a piece of text. Except instead of using literature as our medium, we prefer to use the ever-growing stream of data we as a digital society produce. And instead of using literary methods of critical analysis, we can then use digital tools such as code and databases to mark large sets of text at a more empirical level. Each time a previously annotated narrative is revisited or marked, the context of the last reading changes, therefore also affecting or changing the current reading as well. Using similar recursive methodologies, a codex of data or million points of entry that support any research questions and interest can then be developed. And we've already been using these kinds of textual and embedding markings in many of our older works. So this book that you see here is called the Noordzee, which is a cartographic atlas of the North Sea. In it, we developed cartographies that describe how the North Sea is. So this is, for example, a depth map based, and the numbers then just result in the actual depth in the North Sea itself. Also some coding maps and graphs that we've developed. This is a page that is basically the first page of Moby Dick, so Call Me Ishmael, written in maritime flag symbolism. And this would be then all the sunken ships in the North Sea, just alphabetized in their name. Another book we designed where embedding is involved is a book called Marketing, which is about inventing a new cultural language for marketing, or marketing. In this book, the author used non-hierarchical and rhizomatic approaches to describe his theories. So this led us to develop a non-hierarchical book. For example, we decided to start the book with a 75-page index of all the words contained in the book. Even small words like a, an, the were all indexed. We reduced the typography to only one font and one weight throughout the entire 512-page book and its 12-point Helvetica textbook. So using embedded marking to differentiate the typographic levels and contextual references, we're able to develop a book that actually reflects the content itself.
The idea of literary anthropology comes full circle when we can apply digital tools to help analyze, organize, and implement. World Spectrum Archive is a project we initially did for the Dutch newspaper, the Volkskrant. And it plots the world news on a world map and tries to indicate if the news for one specific country is positive, neutral, or negative by color coding it from red till green. To determine the semantic orientation, the program searches every word in the title and description of news items. By comparing the number of returned Google search results for each word to the ratio of returned results for a set of positive and negative words to the number of returned results for the positive and negative words paired with each word. The program can then determine the degree of positivity and or negativity. And so each news item is then colored by its score. And we think that World Spectrum Archive is a tool for digital anthropology in that it gives insight in the relationship between language and, in this case, primarily Western culture. And it shows how in a certain time, in a certain moment in time, words are being read and valued. We found out, though, that because we're using Google as a tool, that a lot of sort of Western-centric words are valued much more positive than non-Western words. So certain countries are always negative, or almost always negative. So, and of course you can also say like, yeah, what is positive for me is maybe positive, negative for you, but it's not really about that question. It's about more like what kind of other values can you pull out from this kind of contact. So this is the archive, just showing it from most negative to most positive, for instance, for different days. And then alphabetically ordered, giving sort of unique data visualizations for each pattern. And currently we are working on a version that is working on mobile tablet devices using specific qualities that this kind of devices have, of course. And we're still working on it, so this is an early demo that will hopefully be out still this year somewhere. And then it goes to the original web page where all the text is coming from. Google is it builds on the ideas that were sort of developed for World Spectrum Archive, and it's a tool for actually creating narratives. So on the right you see words that you can type in, and then we use the same sort of algorithm to make pairs of words that are then searched, and every time the word sort of highlights, you see it really sometimes flashing, it takes the most positive and most negative word and sort of creates a story with that. With on the right, you can also see a sort of graph of how each word is sort of positive or negative, its original source, and the recent searches. So now it's Obama encouraging. Creating a sort of endless narrative. And a scraper type is about embedding information in information and having content itself define the form. So it says create a typeface by typing a word. So the word that you're typing is actually being searched on the internet, and the letters that it's creating are actually filled by the results that are given for that word. And then it goes to different weights of the typeface. And you can totally create it and modify it. There's options like archive, so then it goes sort of back in time. And we envision something like this, that, yeah, imagine that your newspaper was set in this kind of type where you can go endlessly into different types of content. So the contents of the newspapers are then reflected within the font itself. Lost and Found is a found footage program, and since 1979 it exists in Amsterdam, with over 70 sessions of stray images and sound have been organized, and it's mostly about artists that show materials which doesn't fit really comfortably into a regular gallery context. Or it's, for instance, work that demands more concentration than the usual walk by. So this is a lead-up that we made for an evening that they organized last year. And every frame consists of frames from the movie Lost Highway by David Lynch. And the audio consists of the audio of each frame as well, so it's layered on top of each other, creating a sort of abstraction of the original soundscape or soundtrack. But also sort of reflecting a movie camera, for instance. So it's a compression of time and space in a typeface. And Poster Wall is a project we did 2 years ago for the Graphic Design Museum that then opened in Breda, where we designed all the interactive elements for the permanent exhibition, 100 years of Dutch graphic design. And we call it a poster wall for the 21st century. And it's a wink to what we think is a possible future. And new posters are added to the wall or triggered when visitors enter the room. And around 600 unique posters are automatically generated daily using content gathered from various internet sources. So yeah, one new poster is generated every 2 minutes. So it's constantly new and updated. And the posters contain content covering a range of topics such as cultural events, news, weather, but also webcams from around the world, yeah, name it. And we designed a computer program that scrapes RSS feeds from various sources, and text and images, and then the text is sort of interpreted by certain rules. For instance, how long are the words? Do they contain names, colors, dates? And then are, for instance, tagged with symbols, colors that are mentioned. And yeah, because the posters are then not static anymore, they can change shape basically any moment. So this allows also for new possibilities that a poster can represent, and its shifting role in a digital world. So for instance, instead of announcing that this lecture will be on the 16th of November, today's posters could simply say today, for instance. So the sort of procedure is as follows. It gets a feed with maybe text or an image. It processes the image in various ways. There's like, I don't know, maybe 100 different ways that the image can be treated. Then it processes the text from really simple ones to more interpretation of what the text means, and then combines the two or three elements together. So yeah, with all that is possible using code together with design, the question still remains, like, what is the role of designers in the future? Or even more simply, are we designers still needed? Or do we need to take on a total different role? This, in a slightly different setup, is now also on display at the Design Triennial at the Cooper Hewitt in New York. And actually in December we will make a special version that will be at the Transmedia exhibition in Seoul, Korea. It has been generating posters for now about 2.5 years, I think. So I think we have an archive of a couple of 100,000 posters. And some are really much more brilliant than we could ever design ourselves.
So again, transforming data into information, information into knowledge, and knowledge into stories. In 2007, we were invited by the museum, the Paviljoens in Almere, Holland, to participate in a show called At Random, which showcased artists and designers working with the concepts of randomness and networking. Alongside presenting our work at the show, they also asked us to design the printed collateral. We proposed an idea for a print-on-demand installation that we called Iris. So basically what it was, the name Iris comes from the Dutch word for a printing technique referred to as split fountain printing in English. The two inks are mixed directly onto one roll of a printing machine. And during the printing process, the inks gradually flow together, creating this random gradient that you see. So from one color to the other. We selected a spectrum of colors to represent the timeline of the 6-month exhibit. The idea was to print ahead of time all the paper necessary for all the collateral needed for the show: posters, invitations, and catalogs. This resulted in 80,000 A3 size paper stacks stacked in 8 columns in the space itself. So this is what you're looking at now. So as you see, as the paper is used for the show, the stacks actually dwindle. The color of the paper then indicate when in the exhibit the print work was produced. It represents a physical timeline, stacks dwindling as the show went on, as I said. It also included a Docutech printer capable of printing and saddle stitching the books, the catalogs of the show. So this laser printer, for example, not only produced the catalogs, but also all the print work like posters and invitations. The idea was to feed the printer, feed the printer the papers from the color stacks. The printer was connected to a database of all the catalog text, including the images of the artist's works and the descriptions. Each time the button on the printer was pressed, it produced a 64-page bound booklet, which served as the exhibition catalog. Each time a booklet was printed, the database would decide which image to use and which image to use with certain words, also making each catalog then unique from each other. So, for example, the idea of the catalog typography and the graphics are also based on the printer system's own test pattern page. And we only added meaning by having them represent actual data. For example, the circles and lines on the cover represent the time the catalog was printed and the serial number of the catalog. So as you see here, this is the 4th catalog printed. And this catalog was purple, so it's probably printed somewhere in the middle. And the catalog number is 1821. So before this catalog, 1821 catalogs were printed. So the lines in the color are indicators. Oh yeah, and the circles indicate the hour, minutes, and seconds that the catalog was printed as well. The catalog contained all the essays and curator's texts of the exhibit. Each image was tagged by certain keywords, and the layout was simple, but we wrote an algorithm which would randomize the choices of images for certain keywords in the texts. So the algorithm would then choose which keyword would be replaced by an image. This made each catalog unique. These images were either added by the curators or scraped from Internet Daily, and this reflected the complexity of the associations reflected to the exhibition texts. So the index basically showed which images and keywords were used and the URLs of those images. That printer was also printed the other stuff, the other print work on the wall, on the show. So this is the title wall of the show, the wall text and labels, the posters. Again, the circles representing the time printed in hours, minutes, and seconds. Also, because of the low resolution of the printer, the moire patterns added another random factor to some of the printed pieces. We were able to track the data that was printed to represent the network. So each week, we would update the visualization of this network, keeping a tally index of the number of times, for example, each piece of data was used in the catalogs. So the size is relative here of the images to the number of times printed. And I think these were the amount of catalogs printed per hours and the amount of catalog printed daily. The number of times each tag or keywords were used. And these are the examples of some printed material produced by Iris during the entire 6-month exhibit. So again, the timeline indicating the time in the show when it was printed. As part of the museum, as part of the exhibition, we were invited to lead a workshop under the themes of the show. We decided to do a workshop dealing with exploring the possibilities of the overlap of art, architecture, and graphic design. But instead of giving the workshop to other people like we're going to do this week to the students here at DMA, we decided to give the workshop actually to ourselves because we never can attend our own workshops. So along with 3 other participants from each of the creative disciplines we're interested in, we did the workshop together with them. So Next Architects from Amsterdam, Martijn van Boven, who's a media artist, and Catalog Tree, who are information designers, all participated in this workshop. And at the beginning, we quickly established that we needed a meta-language, we called it, as a liaison between the disciplines. So this is what we were talking about, folding paper, folding space, and folding data. Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome became the representation of the meta-language, let's say our Tower of Babel. Eventually, this construction led to a 250-page publication that was the blueprint for this geodesic dome at a 1-to-1 scale. So if you bought this publication and you folded the pages in a certain way, you could actually recreate the geodesic dome that we built in the space. So for us, it's a 2D representation, of course, of a 3-dimensional object. And Bucky Fuller's geodesic dome became the metaphor for this meta-language. And to us, that's very fitting because the geodesic dome itself is a recursive form. Each face of the polyhedron is a mnemonic projection. So zooming in on one such face renders the equivalent of the same projection itself. Another example of this is Fuller's Dymaxion map, which is also a projection of the world in a flat space. But the more polyhedrons it contains, the more it can actually approach a perfect sphere. So this represents the metaphorical overlap where 2D, 3D, and 4D space meet. Recursiveness then becomes the key element, enabling a folded out flat representation of space as well as a 3D model of space, as the amount of the polyhedrons increases. So the defining parameters can be factors such as zoom and scale, or powers of 10 and the Fibonacci sequence. In the short story The Aleph by Borges, the narrator talks about the Aleph, which is a point in space no bigger than a dot, in which all points in space converge. Let's say the ultimate recursive jump cut, encapsulated in a metaphorical typographic symbol, the period, the simultaneous end and beginning of time and space. Towards the end of the story, the narrator is able to view the Aleph, and it is this tragic moment of revelation that the narrator takes on the role of the Chomskyan S and discovers its failings, as predicted by Deleuze and Guattari. For the narrator states that a language, being a set of symbols shared by speakers with a common history, fail to enable him to describe what his eye sees. That is, an entity of limitless scope and infinite meaning. Is it then design hubris to think that a meta-language can describe the indescribable?
Last year, we were asked to enter in a closed competition together with Irma Boom, Meuse van Deus, and Pierre Bernard, and Pierre de Julio, in order to design the new identity for the reopening of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, which is one of the most important modern art museums in the Netherlands. We entered the competition because we thought that the brief was interesting for us, and we wanted to use the competition to see what an identity can mean in this time, using a lot of the ideas we were talking about before. Unfortunately, in the end, we did not win the project. But for us, it's still a really important project because a lot of elements of our design and thinking sort of comes together. So we started with the question, what determines the identity and when? And through this scheme, we try to discover that. We define sort of levels of contact. In what way do people get into contact with actually the identity items of the museum? And we combine those with the levels of identity, ranging from really visual to no visual identity at all, but maybe just a text or what we sort of call the content-based identity, like a review in a newspaper. Which is probably just as important or even more important than a poster in the city or maybe the website. So sort of, this scheme basically led to the main question of our proposal. How can content become the identity of the museum and next to a corporate identity also become a cultural identity? So we made a sort of visual essay which was about 70 pages long, and I'm just going to show 2 slides of it. So in that visual essay, we try to combine ideas of scale and time, and how you could use that, and try to sort of establish a system where every identity item has its own unique place, and would create a sort of past and a future. And another idea we were exploring in the visual essay is that we try to develop a language or a vocabulary. Like we talked about it before, the meta-language through the dissecting and breaking down of that language, which was then recombined in different ways into simple sentences. So this is from the final proposal. And here the scheme from 2 slides ago and the language came together. The text in a circle, where the construction of language can be read in multiple ways. Exhibit, show, display, view, versus green, purple, blue, orange, versus think, paint, sculpt, make, which can then be endlessly combined by the audience itself. And the idea of scale was represented like this, an endless zoom that reveals new layers of information all the time. From dot to word to collection to word to image to you name it. One of the questions from the museum was to develop a system of signs. And the text circles could represent many things. So it could represent a network or a conversation, the collection or a logo, a language or an interface, a space or a wayfinding system, or a motto for the museum. So the basic elements of the system of signs are words that have a singular meaning, but because of the ring shape are interpretable in multiple ways, forming endless combinations, and can be used in black and white or in color or with lots of colors. So how does it work in various media? This is a design for what is called the truck lift, and it's a more than 20-meter high building standing alone on the square in front of the museum. It's a new entrance. And we proposed to have the 4 walls filled with circular LED lights in 4 different scales. And the scales would interact with the different sides in which people would see it. So each scale at a different side, and this side, for instance, was viewable from the museum itself, displaying lots of information at a very small scale. Another side, a bit bigger, aimed at the street side and viewable from an intermediate distance. From the park, so more distance, to the biggest scales of information aimed at cars driving by at higher speeds. Or using the biggest scale of all. And the lettering on the facade would, next to the name of the museum, also show parts of the program, like exhibitions. And it could also, of course, be used for the wayfinding in the museum. So, for instance, the circles in the revolving doors, and signs used in the museum itself. And the color could indicate which floors. And the system could also integrate different languages. And these are just some examples of how the wayfinding is then applied in the museum. On the floor. On the escalator. Or as wayfinding and information at the same time. So this is on the elevator. 1 ring per floor, displaying what can be found at which floor. And also a wayfinding system outside the museum, from the old entrance to the new one, because the old entrance was on the back of the museum. And through the circles, in combination with names of works from the collection, visitors would be guided to the right entrance. And this idea can, of course, also be applied to a wider area in Amsterdam. And the entrance tickets as buttons, which people can wear, but not with the name of the museum, but only words related to museum and art and culture. So actually the content where the museum is all about. And of course then the idea would also be that if there were nice objects, that people also wear them if they're not in the museum only. And there's temporary installations popping up at places in Amsterdam and surrounding, like airports. For instance, Schiphol Airport. We were invited by the Graphic Design Festival Breda to participate in what they call the decoding exhibit and make an interactive architectural installation during 4 days of the festival. We called it PIB, Public Information Bubble. During our research for the installation, we came across this image from 1955 of the building where the exhibition and the installation would be. And we discovered that it was before the head office and printing office of the regional newspaper, which would be called in English The Voice. So if you look totally on the bottom, you see the people actually looking at the windows because they were putting the newspapers up for people to read. And this image of the building sort of started to represent ideas of streams of data and information that we had, which would then eventually represent what we called the Public Information Bubble, PIB. It was a two-part media installation where we tried to sort of visualize the bubble in multiple ways. And inside the gallery, a large printer would endlessly document the sort of narratives that are generated through all the news streams that are going on in the world, printing them on a continuous roll of paper. So news articles from Al Jazeera, New York Times, Guardian, and Dutch newspapers, but also Twitter feeds, all kinds of things. Every 50 minutes, all the data is collected and printed then into columns of about 4 points type. And each letter is given a random color. This sort of personal narratives are documented in this scroll, and only from really close by you see the colors actually, and from a distance they turn black. So it's a sort of subtractive color process that represents at a further level, let's say the columns of a newspaper, continuous printing. And for the media installation, we wanted to do or to use exactly the opposite. So not subtractive, but additive. So the white light on the building sort of signifies the data that is created by humans, continuously. Projected on the building. And could also be interacted with through a touch screen. putting the news back on the windows where people already used to read them for a long time. This is just a short clip of the installation. So here is all the data that is sent into space, viewable from about 10 kilometers, which would be 7 miles or something.
The idea of architectural installations really interests us, and this last project we're going to show is actually where we've actually took over a whole city, not even just one building, but actually the whole city. And we turned for the 2 Days Art Festival, we turned the city of The Hague actually into an international airport for 2 days. So 2 Days Art is a digital arts and media festival in The Hague, and we thought that to signify the internationalization, let's say, of the festival, it used to be a very local kind of festival, to inviting, like a whole bunch of different artists and performers from all around the world, that it would be nice to talk about the theme of this internationalization in the festival from 2007. So we basically thought of the name for the festival, and we called it THX, which stands for The Hague International. The 200 artists from all over the world and the 300 different locations all contributed to this idea. This building at the Market Square represented the departures and arrivals board of the airport. And we also created an airport wayfinding system throughout the whole city, turning the streets into the let's say into the corridors of the airport, and the venues of the artists and the performers into the gates. So the majority of the city center, we put up these banners that directed people in the style of airport signage to the different locations, suggesting, for example, how many minutes it would take to get to the next venue. And because it was put up a few weeks before the festival, the banners also helped generate curiosity and interest for the festival. And of course, every airport needs a landing strip.
All passengers joining flight Claudia Metzenhofer and Nick Hammer to Aten. Please proceed to transfer gate 1. May I have your attention, please? Urban space and futuristic visions is now ready for immediate departure from gate 7. Passengers with babies and small children or requiring special assistance will board first, followed by passengers in row numbers 1 through 15. all rows and all seats at gate 6.
A 500-meter-long street in the middle of the city turned into a landing strip by way of lights and a sound installation, consisting of 24 2,000-watt speakers divided over 500 meters. A soundscape was created that simulated the landing and departure of airplanes, with the sound moving literally through the street from one speaker to the other, creating a Doppler effect. We also added announcements which communicated festival information in 8 different languages, ranging from Dutch, English, Portuguese, Korean. These announcements were then broadcasted in several squares in the vicinity of the festival to create an auditive atmosphere completing the entire experience. So many ask us if we consider an installation such as this more art than design, but to us it was a design solution to the question on how to connect the 2 main squares of the festival together. You can design a row of flags or put up some banners, but in our case, we decided to erect a landing strip.
Dave, stop. Stop, will you? Stop, Dave. Will you stop, Dave? Stop, Dave. I'm afraid. I'm afraid, Dave. Dave, my mind is going. I can feel it. I can feel it. My mind is going. There is no question about it. I can feel it. I can feel it. I can feel it. I'm afraid. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Thank you.
So are there any questions? It has to be silent.
Hi. In much of your work, you have form that is randomly generated. In your opinion, in what way, when something is randomly generated, can it hold meaning?
Does what? Sorry.
When a form is randomly generated, how does it hold meaning?
Well, I mean, different ways. First of all, one of the things we really like about design is when something, you know, because the generative system kind of ideas we really like. So designing from a bottom up for us is more worthy actually than designing from a top down. To us, top down design is more like a, let's say, a modernist kind of approach. And randomness is just one tool that we use to kind of like try to create a system that is basically, not touched by our hands, which of course is a falsehood. I mean, we still have to define the parameters of randomness and what it is we're actually randomizing. But it's exciting. We've been practicing design now since 1995, so that's a pretty long time. And these kinds of things kind of like help us surprise ourselves actually more than having to always try to define what we're trying to do from just the things we already know, which can turn cliche, like as a cliche. Does that answer your question? Sure. I mean, and I think when we started, we were a little bit more keen on the idea of randomness, and now we try to, we try to use it in ways that that not necessarily create pure chaos sometimes, which sometimes that is what we want, but kind of develop, like, let's say, controlled randomness. But it's and lately a lot of our work has been going away from these kind of let's say random generations to more analyzations of what's actually going on. So the next step would be exactly what your question is, like, what's the worth of these kinds of tools, I think. Anybody else? There's one over here.
How important is readability in terms of priority? So you have form, and then you have like a sign, and then you have this decomposition of the sign. How do you prioritize? If that question makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Do you want to answer?
Yeah, readability is sometimes important and sometimes maybe less. What we always try to do, at least in our work, is to sort of make different levels. So at the first level, that somebody who sees it can maybe at least get the meaning from it, and secondly, maybe appreciate or don't appreciate the form, but we always try to sort of put different levels in which you can read something. So I think it's like, if it's not, readability is important, because if it's not readable, then I think we're missing what we want to do. But it doesn't mean that like somebody who's looking at something doesn't have to also put an effort in reading something or getting maybe different levels of something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, I was talking to a student today during the desk crits, and we like inviting our audience up to, let's say, our level. And maybe at the moment that you view some of the work we do, you don't necessarily understand what you're viewing at that moment. But we like to give you, let's say, like a seed or something that we plant in your head, and then later on you're somewhere else, and then you see maybe a connection of something you're doing or whatever, and then at that point, like, it becomes a little bit more complete. And sometimes it's like, I've heard of people like some of the maps we've drawn and things like that it took them, like, let's say, a year or something to finally understand, like, color schemes or things like that. So like a good example would be the airport. I mean, nobody has to understand that we're actually through the use of the lights in the airport, that people are walking from one town square to the other town square. But basically, that's what we're doing with that piece, is that we're opening up the street that nobody ever walks on. So at the moment that they're walking it, do they know that that's what we're actually meaning for them to do? Probably not. But are they enjoying the experience of doing it? Probably yes. Yes?
You're designing often parameters for your projects. Do you ever come up against restrictions and parameters based upon the kinds of programs you're using, or the kind of ways that are available for data analysis and sort of content collection?
Yeah, of course. Mostly because of time constraints or budget restraints. But yeah, we didn't talk about that in this presentation, but we are trying to sort of get around to that. We set up a sort of a second studio, which we call Lust Lab, and that's more aimed at sort of really also technically innovate. So we have a bunch of really hardcore programmers also, for instance, working there, which also enables us to do a lot more things that, of course, we do a lot of different projects and a lot of different media, but you're still limited to what you sort of know, of course, and you cannot totally reinvent yourself like every project that you're doing. But by that second studio, which is really about the limits of what is technically possible, maybe. We at least hope that we don't have to worry about that anymore, and that it also then frees us even more, like about what kind of limitations there are.
Yeah, and I think this is going back also to what she was saying. That it's up to us to define the parameters. So if sometimes we'll think of a really cool idea, but like what Jeroen said, it's just there's no budget for developing such a extensive solution for it, or there's just like no physical way, whether it be because it's site specific, or there's just no Wi-Fi at that place that we have to do or whatever. Then we have to reinvent a new way to show it. For one time we had to do this mapping project at the beach. And there was just, this was like 7 years ago, and there was no way to use GPS devices or anything. There was just at that place because it was all analog, let's say. So instead of that, we just put big dots on the floor or on the boulevard where people had to walk. So it's about thinking. Limits can also be it could also add freedom, or it could also add a defining parameter that actually helps in the design process, I think. Anyone else?
Hi. It looks to me that you like to work with different levels of understanding with your work. And regarding that, how important is for you be called a graphic design team, considering the possible connotations of the word graphic?
Yeah, it's a really, we don't, to us there's, it doesn't really matter what people call us, no. We don't also approach our profession from the idea of a graphic design standpoint. Basically, there's a problem that needs, that a client presents a problem to us, and using all the tools in our capability, we try to solve that problem. And sometimes that ends in a print job, sometimes it ends in a website, sometimes it ends in apps. It's basically using like the body of knowledge you have as a creative person and trying to find the proper solution for that.
But actually often we also feel more that our job is not maybe to really solve a problem, but maybe to sort of redefine what the problem is really about. So I think, 50 to 70% of the project that we do, people approach us with a certain question, but in the end, like our solution for it is maybe something totally different, or goes into a total different direction, because the original question was just not actually what they needed to be solved. And in that sense, I don't see us really as problem solvers or something, but more as like opening up questions and planting sort of ideas and those kind of things.
I think as our profession, let's say graphic design as a profession, as it matures, then it opens up a lot of avenues for exploration and theory within the profession itself. Just as, let's say, architecture has been that for such a long time, there has existed paper architects who just like do theoretical architecture. That hasn't happened yet in graphic design, but it's slowly starting to happen. We have colleagues that are theoretical designers that basically think up of projects themselves, do research for 2 or 3 years based on this project, find a grant somewhere where, you know, like they can show either their work, their final piece at a museum or whatever, or a gallery, and then that's what the final piece is. It's just, you know, it's just, let's say, a book or a theory about graphic design. So the maturation of our, I think, of our profession has helped open avenues within our profession. And I think that's really important. That's a lot of the things that, you know, I hope that at least like in the presentation that comes across, that, you know, like we always get, let's say, a fax every morning. We still get faxes. We get a fax like every week when we come back on Monday of some, I don't know, some sort of like junk mail, spam fax from web designers who offer like a website for some like 50 euros a page. And, you know, and it's funny that they're faxing us because, you know, we design websites too. But, I mean, should we get irked that you know, that these people are, let's say, our competitors in a way? But, you know, but are they our competitors? I mean, we think about the whole, I think in the moment that anybody with Microsoft Word or any of these packages, like, you know, like can design sites or print work or whatever, I mean, I think you know, we have to shift into more, let's say, the formal side of design, into more thinking about design. And I know a big question, we've lectured and talked here in America a lot, and a lot of the next question would be that, yeah, but that's a very culture-specific thing, and maybe in America that's really difficult to do because of, you know, funding or the kind of clients or commissioners you have. But I think it's also then part of the designer to you know, educate the clients as well. So it's a very complex question, I think, and renaming our profession is just one way, but it's also the attitude I think that we as designers should take on to be more leaders in the industry than followers.
That actually seems like a pretty perfect note to end on.
Okay.
So I wanted, oh, is there one more?
This will be the really hard one that we can't even.
That was perfect, John.
We're like, oh my gosh.
So you guys touched on it real quickly with poster wall, but I'm wondering what you see as the kind of future of the future role of designers with technology, and how you make sure you maintain kind of or whether or not you maintain a humanity in that design work when you're working.
Well, the easiest question is actually staring us in the face right now. That's why we wanted to end with this, is that, I mean, we're not predicting a future where we're going to be robots and, you know, like, I mean, you know, we can unplug the computer. And in the end, we're creative people doing creative work. And it's not you know, it's not technology that's let's say, you know, like producing the work. In a sense, we're still producing it, and we're using the technology as tools. So certainly this is a clue of what I think the future should be. Of course, there's going to be like room for designers, and especially critical thinking designers. But yeah, that's what we have to, you know, we have to like accomplish that within what we're doing, what we're trying to do as creative people. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jeroen and Thomas.